There is a small brass key that Elizabeth carried in her coat pocket for almost a year before she understood what it opened. Her father pressed it into her hand on the last afternoon of his life. He did not leave her the mansion. He did not leave her the auction house that carried the family name. He did not leave her the money, and there was a great deal of money, or so everyone believed. He left her a key, a dusty warehouse no one had walked into for 30 years, and one sentence, spoken so quietly she had to lean in to hear it. Her brother laughed when the will was read. Her sister called it an insult, and Elizabeth said nothing at all. Stay until the end, because what was sitting in the dark of that warehouse was worth more than the mansion, the name, and the bank accounts combined. And the only person in the family who never went looking for it was the only person their father trusted to find it. For 4 generations, the name Ashford meant one thing in Charleston: glass. Not windows, not bottles, the other kind. The kind that lives behind locked cases and travels under guard. Crystal, cut stem and gilded rim. Pieces that had crossed an ocean before there were light bulbs to read them by. The Ashford auction house sat on a quiet street near the old harbor, behind a heavy door the color of dark wine. And inside it, people in soft voices spent more on a single decanter than most families spent on a car. Edward Ashford ran it the way his father had, and his grandfather before him. He had a way of holding a glass up to the window, turning it slowly, and going completely silent, and everyone in the room learned to go silent with him, because whatever he was listening for, it was worth hearing. He had 3 children. 2 of them learned how to wear the name. One of them learned how to carry it. Preston was the eldest. He had his father's height and none of his father's patience. He liked the part of the business that happened at dinners, the handshakes, the wine, the way a wealthy buyer leaned in when Preston lowered his voice, as if letting them in on a secret. He could sell. He simply could not sit still long enough to learn what he was selling. Vivian was the middle child. She had decided very young that the family fortune was a kind of weather, something that was simply there, the way the sun is there, requiring nothing from her but the good sense to stand in it. She spent. She was charming about it. She believed with total sincerity that taste was the same thing as knowledge. And then there was Elizabeth. Elizabeth was the youngest, and she was the one who was actually in the building. She arrived before the staff and left after them. She was the one who cataloged the new acquisitions, who handled the pieces no one else trusted themselves to hold, who sat with the restorers and learned, hour by quiet hour, how to read a maker's mark the way other people read a face. She knew which dealers lied and which ones only exaggerated. She knew the provenance of every important piece that had passed through those doors in 20 years. The clients knew her name. Her own brother and sister, when they introduced her, sometimes forgot to mention that she was family at all. Edward got sick the way strong men often do, all at once after years of pretending he wasn't tired. The house changed overnight, and the change told Elizabeth everything she needed to know about the people she had grown up with. Preston started speaking about the business in the past tense, as if his father were already gone. He met with a man who valued commercial real estate, quietly, he thought, though nothing in that house was ever truly quiet. Vivian began referring to her half of things, and then, when she did the arithmetic and remembered there were 3 of them, to the family's wishes, by which she meant her own. They did not sit with their father.
Elizabeth did.
She sat in the dim room in the evenings after the auction house closed, and she did not talk about the will or the building or the money. She told him which pieces had sold that week and to whom. She described a goblet she had cleaned that afternoon, the way the light had come through it. And her father, who could barely lift his head, would close his eyes and smile, because she was the only one who still spoke to him in the language he had spent his whole life inside. On the last afternoon, they were alone. Edward did not give her a speech. He had never been a man of speeches. He reached under his pillow, with a slowness that cost him something, and he put a small brass key into her palm and folded her fingers over it. She thought he was wandering. She started to call for the nurse. He shook his head, and then he said the things she would turn over in her mind for the next year, the things she would not understand until she was standing in the dark with dust on her hands.
Glass doesn't show its real color in the light. It shows it after the fire. Be patient. Grace and time tell you what a thing is really worth.
That was all. He died 2 days later, on a gray morning, with rain coming sideways off the harbor. Preston handled the announcements. Vivian chose the flowers. Elizabeth was the one who went to the auction house at 6 in the morning, before anyone arrived, and stood alone in the main room among the locked cases, and let herself feel it, once, completely, and then washed her face and unlocked the doors for the day. There was work to be done. The will was read in a lawyer's office, with a long table and a view of the steeple. Preston brought 2 attorneys of his own, which told you everything about what he was expecting. Vivian wore the kind of black that costs more than mourning should. The estate lawyer, a careful older man named Mr. Calloway, read it through without inflection, the way a good professional does when he suspects the document is about to detonate. The mansion went to Preston and Vivian, jointly. The auction house, the name, the building, the active inventory, went to Preston and Vivian, jointly. The accounts, the investments, the holdings, Preston and Vivian, jointly. And to Elizabeth, to the only one of them who had spent her adult life inside the business, their father left the old storage warehouse at the back of the property, the one no one had opened in 30 years, the one full of crates that the family had always called, with a kind of affectionate dismissal, the junk shed. And the key to it. There was a silence. Then Preston laughed. He tried not to, and that made it worse. The laugh came out of him sideways, almost apologetic, the laugh of a man who has just been handed everything and finds it slightly funny that anyone expected otherwise.
Well, at least it's hers.
Vivian did not laugh. She did something colder. She looked at Elizabeth with real sympathy, the sympathy people offer when they've decided you've lost. And she said,
"You can sell the crates by the pound, I suppose. Daddy always was sentimental about that shed."
Elizabeth did not argue. She did not raise her voice, or ask to see the document, or point out, as she easily could have, that she was the only person at that table who could tell a museum-grade piece from a reproduction. She did not remind them whose hands had actually held the business together while their father was dying. She thanked Mr. Calloway. She signed where she was asked to sign. She stood and she put on her coat, and in the pocket of that coat was the small brass key. It had started to rain again. She walked out of the office and across the old property to the back, past the grand house where her brother and sister were already, audibly, beginning to celebrate, and she came to the low brick warehouse with its single padlocked door. She stood in front of it for a moment, with the rain in her hair. She was not thinking about fairness. She had stopped expecting fairness from those two a long time ago. She was thinking about her father's face on the last afternoon, and the way he had folded her fingers over the key, and the words that had no sense. Grace and time tell you what a thing is really worth. She put the key in the lock. It turned. The door swung inward on 30 years of dark. The air inside was cold and dry and smelled of old paper and dust. Light came through a row of high, grimy windows and fell in long, pale bars across the floor, and in those bars, Elizabeth could see what the family had been laughing at. Crates. Dozens of them. Wooden, nailed shut, stamped with shipping marks in languages she half recognized. Straw spilling from the seams. Decades of neglect lying over everything like gray snow. She did not feel disappointment. She felt something closer to curiosity, the particular alertness that had made her good at her work, because Edward Ashford had been many things, but he had never been careless with glass. A man does not leave his most devoted child a shed full of garbage and call it grace. She found a crowbar. She chose a single crate near the window, and she worked the lid loose, and she reached into the straw. Her fingers closed around a stem. She drew it out into the light, and she wiped the dust away with the cuff of her coat, and she went very still, the same stillness her father used to fall into when he held a glass up to the window. Because she had just recognized something she had only ever read about. It was a goblet, plain at first glance, heavier than it looked, the kind of piece an untrained eye would walk straight past. But Elizabeth had not had an untrained eye since she was 19. She turned it over, and there, on the underside of the foot, almost invisible, worked into the glass itself rather than stamped on after, was a tiny figure, a mark. She tilted it to the window until the light caught the engraving, and her breath stopped. She knew that mark. Everyone in her trade knew that mark, the way astronomers know a star they will never see in their lifetime. It belonged to a master glassmaker of the 19th century, a man whose workshop had burned, whose records were lost, whose signed pieces had become so rare that the great houses spoke of them in the past tense. There were a handful in the world's museums. Collectors had spent decades and fortunes chasing rumors of more. And here was one, in her hand, in a crate, in a shed her family had laughed about. She set it down very gently on the workbench, as if it might hear her. Then she looked at the other crates, the dozens of them, lining the dark, and she understood the size of what her father had done. He had not left her the junk shed. He had left her the secret. While Elizabeth worked, the rest of the family lived. Preston, freed at last from his father's careful supervision, ran the auction house the way he ran everything, for the feeling of it. He threw a launch party for the new era of Ashford, with a band and a bar and a guest list chosen for how it would look. He bought a car he could not explain. He raised the staff's titles and lowered their numbers. He spoke, often, about vision. Vivian redecorated the mansion twice. Neither of them understood the one thing their father had understood in his bones, that the business did not run on charm or vision or imported marble. It ran on knowing what a thing was worth. And the only person who had ever truly known that had just been escorted, smiling, out of the building. They began to make mistakes, small at first. A piece sold for 1/10 of its value because no one in the room could authenticate it. A buyer who never came back because Preston had promised a provenance he could not produce. The slow, invisible leak of a reputation that had taken 4 generations to build and could be emptied in a single careless year. They did not notice. People rarely notice the floor giving way. They notice the fall. Elizabeth told no one. She did not announce her discovery. She did not march into the grand house and wave the goblet in her brother's face. And she could have. The temptation was human and it was real. She thought about it once, standing in the cold of the warehouse, with the proof of her father's faith in her hand, and then she set the thought down beside the thought of fairness, in the place where she kept things she had decided not to carry. Instead, she worked. She brought in a single space heater and a good lamp. She cleaned the high windows herself. Crate by crate, night after night, she unpacked what her father had quietly gathered across 40 years of a life spent at the very top of his trade. The pieces he had bought and never resold, the ones he could not bear to let go of, the ones he had hidden in plain sight under a name the family used to laugh at. She photographed each piece. She measured it, described it, traced its mark, built its history. She filled notebook after notebook in her small, exact handwriting. She was not making an inventory. She was building a case, the way another woman in another city had once built a case at a kitchen table at 2 a.m, quietly, completely, with every document in order. Word moves through a small trade the way scent moves through still air. A photograph she had shown to one trusted restorer reached by a chain of careful people a man named Mr. Adler. Mr. Adler was the kind of authority who does not have a storefront. He advised museums that did not name their advisors and collectors who did not wish to be collected. He flew economy and stayed in modest hotels. He owned, it was rumored, a private holding of 19th century glass that no public institution could match. He had spent his life learning to be invisible, because invisibility, in his world, was the same thing as power. He came to Charleston without telling anyone. He did not go to the grand auction house, where Preston was at that very hour hosting a tasting. He went to the back of the property, to the low brick building with the cleaned windows and the single lamp burning late, and he knocked. Elizabeth opened the door in her work coat, dust on her hands. He introduced himself. She knew the name. Of course she knew the name. She let him in. She did not perform for him. She simply turned on the lights and stepped back and let him see. Mr. Adler walked the length of the warehouse very slowly. He stopped at the workbench. He picked up the first goblet, the plain, heavy one, and he turned it to the light, and he went completely, perfectly still. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the voice of a man making an offer. It was the voice of a man who has found something he stopped believing existed. They talked until the lamp was the only light left in Charleston, it seemed. Mr. Adler did not flatter her, which she respected. He told her plainly what she was sitting on. He told her that a collection like this, intact, authenticated, traceable, did not come to market. It had not come to market in his lifetime. He told her the names of the cities that would want it. A private exhibition, first, somewhere discreet, then Paris, then New York. He told her without drama the kind of number that changes the shape of a person's life. And Elizabeth, who had been underestimated by experts her entire life, did something that surprised even him. She did not say yes immediately.
I'd like it kept quiet, for now.
He looked at her for a long moment.
You have family.
It was not a question.
I have time, and so do the pieces. They've waited 100 years. They can wait a little longer.
Mr. Adler had spent 40 years learning to read people the way he read glass, for the hidden mark, the true maker, underneath the surface. He looked at the quiet woman in the dusty coat, who had just declined to humiliate the people who had humiliated her, and who had chosen patience over the cheap, immediate pleasure of being right.
Your father, he knew which one of you to give it to.
It took less than a year for the grand house to fall. It did not fall in a single dramatic stroke. It fell the way these things actually fall, in invoices, in a line of credit called in a buyer's lawsuit over a piece that was not what Preston had sworn it was. In the slow discovery, by everyone who mattered in the trade, that the new Ashford did not know what he was selling. The parties stopped. The staff thinned. The wine got cheaper and then disappeared. Preston, who had never in his life sat still long enough to learn the value of anything, learned the value of everything at once, all at the wrong end. Vivian, who believed taste was the same as knowledge, discovered the difference the way you discover a step that isn't there. By the end, the creditors were no longer calling, they were arriving. And the mansion and the name and the historic property at the heart of it all, including a certain low brick warehouse at the back, were posted for sale to cover the debt. Preston and Vivian came to the warehouse on a cold afternoon because they had nowhere else left to be loud. They were not, in the end, frightening. That was the strange thing Elizabeth noticed as they came through the door. They were frightened. Preston's anger had the thin, brittle quality of a man performing for himself. Vivian's coldness had cracked into something that kept reaching for cruelty and missing. They told her they were selling the whole property. They told her the shed would be cleared with everything else, that whatever junk their father had left her would go in the same truck as the rest. Preston said it almost gently, the way you tell a child the dog has died, as if her loss were the smallest casualty in a much larger catastrophe, beneath their notice. Elizabeth did not argue with them. She had never once argued with them. She set down the goblet she had been cleaning. She picked up a folder from the workbench, a plain black folder, thick with paper, every page in order, and she held it for a moment without opening it.
Before you sign anything, there are 2 things you should read.
The first was a letter from Mr. Adler, on the letterhead of an authority whose name made Vivian's face change before she had finished the first line. It was a formal, authenticated valuation of the contents of the warehouse, of the junk shed. The number at the bottom was larger than the mansion, larger than the auction house, larger, in fact, than the mansion and the auction house, and the debt against them combined, and then some. Preston read it twice. He did not laugh this time. The second document was older. It was a codicil, drawn up by Mr. Calloway and signed by their father in the last clear-eyed month of his life. A single quiet clause that none of them had ever bothered to read, because none of them had ever bothered to read anything their father did not shout. In careful legal language, what Edward Ashford had been too proud and too tender to say out loud at the reading. That in the event the principal estate was ever sold under debt, the owner of the rear property, the holder of the brass key, would hold the right of first refusal over the entire historic estate, at a price the codicil itself set. A price that, against the value sitting in her notebooks and her crates, Elizabeth could now meet without selling a single one of her father's hidden pieces. Their father had not left her out. He had left her last on purpose, because last was where the real thing was hidden, and only she had ever been patient enough to find it. The grand house was Elizabeth's by spring. She did not change the name on the door. Ashford had meant glass in Charleston for 4 generations, and it would go on meaning it, only now it would be true again. The pieces came out of the warehouse one at a time, traveled quietly to a discreet exhibition, and then to Paris, and then to New York, exactly as Mr. Adler had said. The trade, which had nearly buried the name, lined up to be associated with it. And Preston and Vivian stood in the main room of the auction house they had lost, in front of the sister they had forgotten to call family, and they waited for the thing they had earned. The sermon, the cold satisfaction, the single sentence she had every right to say. Elizabeth did not say it. She looked at the two of them, at her brother who had never learned to sit still, at her sister who had mistaken taste for knowledge, and she felt no triumph, only the long, tired tenderness of someone who has finally stopped waiting for people to be other than they are. There's work here, real work. If you want to learn it the way I learned it, you can stay. Vivienne started to speak. Elizabeth raised one hand, not in anger, in something closer to mercy. Glass only shows its real color after the fire. Daddy told me that. I didn't understand it for a year. You don't have to understand it today. She turned the goblet over in her hands, the plain, heavy one, the first one, the one with the master's hidden mark, and the late light came through it and threw a thread of gold across the dark floor. She had been the overlooked one, the quiet one, the piece her family walked straight past. She had only ever needed one person to know how to look. And he had. Maybe you know what it is to be the one who is overlooked. To be the one who stays in the building while others take the bows. To do the real work in the quiet and watch someone louder be handed the credit. To be underestimated so completely for so long that you begin